gasped Ron, as he sprang to his feet again, staring up at the thing that had appeared. Sorry, the light's not really good for your picture. There it is. You can see what it was in the sky. For a split second, Harry thought it was another leprechaun formation. Then he realized that it was a colossal skull, composed of what looked like emerald stars, with a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. As they watched, it rose higher and higher, blazing in a haze of greenish smoke, etched against the black sky like a new constellation. Suddenly, the wood all around them erupted with screams. Harry didn't understand why, but the only possible cause was the sudden appearance of the skull, which had now risen high enough to illuminate the entire wood, like some grisly neon sign. He scanned the darkness for the person who had conjured the skull, but he couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" he called again. "Harry, come on, move!" Hermione had seized the back of his jacket and was tugging him backwards. "What's the matter?" Harry said, startled to see her face so white and terrified. "It's the Dark Mark, Harry," Hermione moaned, pulling him as hard as she could. "You know whose sign?"
It's the Dark Mark.
Yeah, it's the Dark Mark. Voldemort? Harry, come on! Harry turned. Ron was hurriedly scooping up his miniature crumb. The three of them started across the clearing, but before they had taken more than a few hurried steps, a series of popping noises announced the arrival of 20 wizards, appearing from thin air, surrounding them. Harry whirled around, and in a split second he registered one fact. Each of these wizards had his wand out, and every wand was pointed right at himself, Ron, and Hermione. Without pausing to think, he yelled, "Duck!" He seized the other two and pulled them down onto the ground. "Stupefy!" roared 20 voices. There was a blinding series of flashes, and Harry felt the hairs on his head ripple as though a powerful wind had swept the clearing. Raising his head a fraction of an inch, he saw jets of fiery red light flying over them from the wizards' wands, crossing each other, bouncing off tree trunks, rebounding into the darkness. "Stop!" yelled a voice he recognized. "Stop! That's my son!" Harry's hair stopped blowing about. He raised his head a little higher. The wizard in front of him had lowered his wand. He rolled over and saw Mr. Weasley striding towards them, looking terrified. "Ron! Harry!" His voice sounding shaky. "Hermione, are you all right?" "Out of the way, Arthur," said a cold, curt voice. It was Mr. Crouch. He and the other Ministry wizards were closing in on them. Harry got to his feet to face them. Mr. Crouch's face was taut with rage. "Which of you did it?" he snapped, his sharp eyes darting between them. "Which of you conjured the Dark Mark?" "We didn't do it." "We didn't do that," said Harry, gesturing up at the skull. "We didn't do anything," said Ron, who was rubbing his elbow and looking indignantly at his father. "What did you want to attack us for?" "Do not lie, sir," shouted Mr. Crouch. His wand was still pointed directly at Ron, and his eyes were popping. He looked slightly mad. "You have been discovered at the scene of the crime, Barty," whispered a witch in a long woolen dressing gown. "The kids, Barty. They'd never have been able to." "Where did the mark come from, you three?" said Mr. Weasley quickly. "Over there," said Hermione shakily, pointing at the place where they had heard the voice. "There was someone behind the trees. They shouted words, an incantation." "Oh, stood over there, did they?" said Mr. Crouch, turning his popping eyes on Hermione now, disbelief etched all over his face. "Said an incantation, did they? You seem very well informed about how that mark is summoned, Missy." But none of the Ministry wizards, apart from Mr. Crouch, seemed to think it was remotely likely that Harry, Ron, and Hermione had conjured the skull. On the contrary, at Hermione's words, they had raised all of their wands again, and were pointing in the direction she had indicated, squinting through the dark trees. "We're too late," said the witch in the woolen dressing gown, shaking her head. They'll have disapparated. I don't think so, said a wizard with a scrubby brown beard. It was Amos Diggory, Cedric's father. Our stunners went right through those trees. There's a good chance that we got them. Amos, be careful, said a few of the wizards warningly, as Mr. Diggory squared his shoulders, raised his wand, marched across the clearing, and disappeared into the darkness. Hermione watched him vanish with her hands over her mouth. A few seconds later, they heard Mr. Diggory shout, "Yes, we got them. There's someone here, unconscious. But blimey. Got someone," shouted Mr. Crouch, sounding highly disbelieving. Who is it?" They heard snapping twigs and rustling of leaves, and then crunching footsteps as Mr. Diggory re-emerged from behind the trees. He was carrying a tiny limp figure in his arms. Harry recognized the tea towel at once. It was Winky. Mr. Crouch did not move or speak as Mr. Diggory deposited Mr. Crouch's elf on the ground at his feet. The other Ministry wizards were all staring at Mr. Crouch. For a few seconds, Crouch remained transfixed, his eyes blazing in his white face as he stared down at Winky. Then he appeared to come to life again. "This cannot be," he said jerkily. "No." He moved quickly around Mr. Diggory and strode off towards the place where they had found Winky. "No point, Mr. Crouch," said Mr. Diggory, calling after him. "There's no one else there." But Mr. Crouch did not seem prepared to take his word for it. They could hear him moving around, rustling of leaves, as he pushed the bushes aside, searching. "Bit embarrassing," said Mr. Diggory grimly, looking down at Winky's unconscious form. "Barty Crouch's house elf, I mean to say." "Come off it, Amos," said Mr. Weasley quietly. "You don't seriously think it was the elf? The dark mark's a wizard's sign. It requires a wand." "Yep," said Mr. Diggory, "and she had a wand." "What?" said Mr. Weasley. "Here, look." Mr. Diggory held up a wand and showed it to Mr. Weasley. "Had it in her hand? So that's clause 3 of the Code of Wand Use broken for a start. No non-human creatures are permitted to carry or use a wand." Just then there was another pop, and Ludo Bagman appeared right next to Mr. Weasley, looking breathless and disoriented. He spun on the spot, goggling upwards at the emerald green skull. "The dark mark," he panted, almost trampling Winky as he turned inquiringly to his colleagues. "Who did it? Did you get them? Barty? What's going on?" Mr. Crouch was returning empty-handed, his face still ghostly white, and his hands and his toothbrush mustache were both twitching. "Where have you been, Barty?" said Bagman. "Why weren't you at the match? Your elf was saving you a seat, too. Gulping gargoyles." Bagman had just noticed Winky lying at his feet. "What happened to her?" "I've been busy, Ludo," said Mr. Crouch, still talking in the same jerky fashion, barely moving his lips. "And my elf has been stunned." "Stunned? By you lot? You mean, but why?" Comprehension dawned suddenly on Bagman's round, shiny face. He looked up at the skull, down at Winky, and then at Mr. Crouch. "No," he said. "Winky? Conjure the dark mark? She wouldn't know how. She'd need a wand for a start. "And she had one," said Mr. Diggory. "I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we should hear what she's got to say for herself." Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his own wand, pointed at Winky, and said, "Renovate." Winky stirred feebly. Her great brown eyes opened, and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way.